Tonight at 10, the long-awaited plans for social care in England expected to be unveiled tomorrow. How care is funded, especially for the elderly, is the main question. Suggestions of a rise in national insurance have angered Conservative MPs. And there's over £5 billion extra for the NHS in England this year to cope with the backlog caused by the pandemic.
We are committed to our plans on adult social care and new settlement, but also today's announcement of this extra funding of £5.4 billion over the next 6 months for the NHS will really help tackle that backlog.
We'll have more on what's likely to be in tomorrow's expected announcement, also tonight. In Afghanistan, the Taliban say they've taken the last area of resistance and now control the entire country. As millions of pupils return to school in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, we report on how cases of COVID are being monitored.
Sport on the BBC News channel. Team Europe looks to make history in America's backyard in the last leg of the Solheim Cup.
Good evening. The challenge that's defeated governments for many years, that of funding social care, especially for the elderly, is back in the spotlight. Boris Johnson is all set to unveil his plans for England as early as tomorrow. How they're funded is a matter of heated debate, with suggestions of a rise in national insurance provoking anger among some Conservative MPs. The package also involves extra funding for the NHS in England this year, some £5.4 billion. That is to cope with the backlog caused by the pandemic. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are expecting to get their own corresponding increases. We start tonight with this report by our political editor, Laura Kuensberg.
The strain, the sadness, all too familiar. Steve had to sell his parents' Worcestershire house after his father passed away, and his mum's dementia developed so much she needed full-time care. She still doesn't know that their family home is gone.
Why did my dad bother to get himself such a decent pension and pay into a pension scheme for all that time? It doesn't seem to be worth it in the long run. My mum, with the dementia, she doesn't know that house has been sold. If she was of sound mind, but it was a body that had let her down, she had to go to home, I don't know how I would have even told her this. I don't know how I could have even sat there and said, Mum, we've sold the house, we've got this for it, and it's going to have to pay for your care.
The promise to ease that kind of heartache is familiar too, made repeatedly long before his first moment in Number 10.
We will fix the crisis in social care once and for all with a clear plan we have prepared.
But you might remember this commitment too.
We can do all these things without raising our income tax, VAT or national insurance contributions. That's our guarantee.
But forget this part of the manifesto. Tomorrow Boris Johnson's expected to emerge to say, in fact, you can't have it all. On course to announce a rise in national insurance tax for workers and employers to raise billions, and already around another £5 billion for the NHS in England by next April.
Everyone would want to know that we are committed to our plans on adult social care and new settlement, but also today's announcement of this extra funding of £5.4 billion over the next 6 months for the NHS will really help tackle that backlog, and that's a huge priority for us.
So Downing Street's preparing to break one promise to keep another. After months of haggling, the government's expecting to announce a limit on the amount any one family in England pays towards the cost of care, and pump billions into the health service to catch up after the pandemic. The exact price tag, that's not yet clear. But the resistance to how it's to be paid for, well, that certainly is. One cabinet minister told me hiking national insurance is the wrong thing to do and the wrong way to do it. Others prefer to talk seemingly about the cricket.
England have lost a third wicket, I think, what it was at the moment.
But plenty of MPs are publicly worried.
In my view, I think raising national insurance is the wrong approach. Someone earning £30,000 a year will pay a far bigger portion of their income in national insurance than someone earning, say, £250,000.
Would you be willing to vote against it?
I haven't shied away from making my view clear. I want to give the government the freedom and the flexibility to change, but there are a significant number of colleagues, I think, who are opposed to a national insurance rise per se.
Tonight, those restless Tory MPs were pressing the flesh with the Chancellor and the Prime Minister. a friendly crowd by the river as the Commons gets back to business. But the arguments in the weeks ahead may be anything but polite. And Hugh, it's only day one and already in the Tory party things have got pretty fractious over all of this. The Chancellor was urging his colleagues to be loyal and to stick together in the weeks ahead. There's going to be a big package of measures tomorrow to get our head around. A couple of things I'm hearing tonight are that the rise in national insurance we expect will be branded up along the lines of a health and social care levy to try to give a sense that it's specifically for looking after the ill and the most vulnerable. And I'm also hearing that money being made available for the NHS over the next 3 to 4 years will be expected to increase the capacity of the NHS to something like 110% of what it's currently at. Remember, though, and this is really important, when it comes to the changes to care for the elderly and vulnerable, that creaking social care system, it works differently in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And the measures tomorrow specifically about changes to the system will relate to England, but the money, the extra cash, maybe 10 or 12 billion pounds, will be made available right around different parts of the UK. After so many years and successive governments ducking this challenge, Boris Johnson seems determined to have the fight and make this part of his legacy. But tomorrow is about big money. It's a big political moment. But there's no question, even before we know all the details, there are big arguments ahead.
Laura, many thanks. We'll talk again tomorrow. Laura Kuenssberg, our political editor. And indeed, as Laura was saying, the extra money announced for the NHS today is for the current financial year. There's a much bigger question about funding for the next 3 years, given the enormous challenges posed by the pandemic and, of course, that backlog for all kinds of treatments. And indeed the growing challenge of funding social care. NHS leaders are understood to be wanting an extra £10 billion a year just for next year, that's in England, to cover day-to-day services. Our health editor Hugh Pym looks at the plans and the options.
The funding of health and social care. It's one of the biggest and trickiest issues facing ministers in all the UK's administrations. The needs of an ageing population must be addressed, and on top of that, the costs of COVID, with some vital decisions for England expected tomorrow. A 5-year plan for day-to-day spending by NHS England was announced in 2018. That's what the blue line shows. The orange line shows what's actually happening because of COVID, including today's funding announcement. The question now, how much more will be needed from next year?
The scale of the backlog of waiting that we're seeing already, and we're expecting to grow for many years to come as people haven't had care over the last 18 months, is going to have a profound effect on the NHS. But also, if we can't run services as efficiently as we used to because of infection control, that adds to costs.
The Treasury will have worked out what it thinks is affordable for the NHS. It's understood there's been a fierce debate with health ministers and officials over what's required to tackle the huge challenges ahead. The NHS relies on a smooth-running social care system, and not just for the elderly. About half of council spending in England is for the under 65s with disabilities. The question is how much more government funding is planned. So where might the extra money for the NHS and social care come from? Well, national insurance has been talked about. That's paid by those in work and their employers, but not by those above retirement age. Then there's income tax, which covers income above certain limits, including what pensioners get from their investments. Other taxes include capital gains tax and VAT, but those seem less likely options. Then there's higher borrowing, but that would have to be added to already high levels of government debt.
Choosing income tax is something that no government has done other than right at the very top. Since the early 1970s, it's 50 years since we've had an increase in the main rates of income tax. Governments really hate to do that. National insurance contributions have actually risen quite a lot over the last 30 or 40 years. Governments seem keener to do that because actually the population seems happier with it.
So ministers have to decide who pays and how much. Higher health spending in England automatically means proportionate increases for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Their ministers in turn need to make awkward decisions on how the money is allocated. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
Well, finding a credible funding solution for social care in England has been on the Conservative agenda for over a decade. We heard a little about that earlier on. Back in 2011, David Cameron set up a commission chaired by the economist Sir Andrew Dilnot to come up with proposals. And those proposals included no one having to pay more than £35,000 for their care. The state would pay for everything after that level. And people would need at least £100,000 in savings and assets before having to pay anything. But plans to implement these proposals were delayed and then dropped by subsequent governments. Now, our social affairs correspondent Alison Holt is here. Alison, to what extent can we expect the Johnson proposals, if I can call them that, to be roughly based on what we've just heard there?
That's certainly what we're expecting. And if that is confirmed tomorrow, then the big question is going to be what level will that cap be set at? We know there have been arguments, discussions going on about whether it should be around about 50,000 or around about 80,000. The smart money at the moment seems to be pointing to that higher figure. And we also know from those past proposals that if someone is in residential care, then it's the care costs that count towards that cap or limit. It's not the accommodation costs. But so far, so much of the discussion has been about how we pay for these reforms with relatively little focus on what they need to do. We've also had a lot about selling houses and whether or not that's the right thing for people to be doing. But to concentrate on that is an oversimplification. It is worth saying that at the moment, if you have more than £23,250 in savings and assets, you will be on your own when it comes to paying for care, whether you live in a council house that you bought under Right to Buy or whether you live in a mansion. And the reason is because the current care system is in crisis. It's underfunded, it can have patchy quality, it struggles to get staffing. And in residential care, the people who pay for themselves end up subsidising those who get council help. Local authorities also spend about half their money on younger adults with disabilities, and they're unlikely to have their needs addressed in tomorrow's plans. So the danger of too much heat and noise when it comes to how we pay for care is that even though that's important, we won't be concentrating on what sort of a care system we want for the future, because at its best it can keep people out of hospital and it can help them to have that better life for longer.
Alison, many thanks once again. Alison Holt, our social affairs correspondent. Now let's move on to some of the day's other news. In Afghanistan, the Taliban say they're now in full control of the entire country after seizing the Panjshir Valley in the last area of armed resistance. The Taliban have released a video of their flag being raised in the centre of the provincial capital. The leader of the resistance fighters has called for a national uprising against the Taliban. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, has sent this report.
A white flag of victory, the Taliban flag, the centre of the scenic Panjshir Valley. This last redoubt of armed opposition now claimed by the Taliban. God is great, their fighters cry. In Kabul today, the Taliban spokesman had a message for the enemy.
We have captured Panjshir with the will of God. We are telling those people who still want to fight, if they want a normal life, they are welcome in Afghanistan, their home. But they need to stop fueling instability.
A defiant reply on social media. 32-year-old Commander Ahmed Massoud vows to continue the resistance. He says his men are still in Panjshir Valley and urges Afghans to rise up. The Taliban are getting on with the business of being in charge. This is the first visit by the UN's humanitarian chief, Martin Griffiths. He also stopped by here earlier today, a tented camp in a Kabul park. Thousands displaced by fighting in northern provinces when the Taliban advanced towards Kabul. Displacement, drought, hunger. Afghanistan was confronting a major humanitarian crisis even before the Taliban took power. Now the needs of this nation pose an urgent test for the international community and the Taliban. Shafiqa tells me she lost her husband in this war. Now she worries the Taliban won't let her work to support 4 children. What should we eat? What should we do? At Kabul airport before he left, Mr Griffiths told us he stressed the rights of women in his talks here.
The international community needs to know that there is a genuine will on the part of the authorities to adhere to these principles, to understand them, and to learn about them over time. I've heard good words here, but none of us believe only in the value of words.
Many now wait to see what the Taliban will do. Aid agencies, allies, most of all Afghans. The first step, forming a government to start moving forward. Lise Doucette, BBC News, Kabul.
A court in Belarus has given lengthy prison sentences to two key opposition figures who led protests against President Lukashenko last year. Judges found that Maria Kolesnikova and Maxim Zhnak were guilty of extremism and plotting to seize power. The USA and Britain have condemned the sentencing. They say, like the European Union, that it entails a blatant violation of human rights. Criminal gangs are once again smuggling migrants across the English Channel. After 2 weeks of bad weather stopped them from doing so, 5 children are among 160 people detained by the UK Border Force. Another child was with more than 20 people on an inflatable boat that was rescued by the French authorities after it ran into difficulties. Let's have the latest tonight on the pandemic, and let's have a look at the official data. As it stands, there were just over 41,000 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period, which means an average of 37,698 cases per day in the past week. Latest figures show 7,606 people in hospital being treated for COVID. 45 deaths were reported in the latest 24-hour period. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID test. And that takes the average number of deaths per day to 113 over the past week. Now, on vaccinations, nearly 88.8% of people over the age of 16 in the UK have had their first jab, and nearly 80% have now had both doses. More than 9 million children in England, Wales and Northern Ireland are back at school this week. The UK government says the number of coronavirus cases will be monitored very carefully. Cases in Scotland have risen since the school term began in the middle of August. Our education editor, Bramman Jeffries, has spent the day in the village of Ringmer in East Sussex as children return to the classroom there.
Good morning. Good morning, Lily.
A welcome to soothe any new term nerves.
Good morning. Hi, Mikey.
Good morning, Archie.
For Dolphin class, a return to familiar routines. Here, they don't talk about catch-up, though there will be extra help.
Here, haven't we? How many more do we need to add?
3.
The parents say social skills and confidence are the priority.
I think it's going to take a little while for children to develop those social skills again. And to reach out to new people.
They will filter through, and I just think really it's more just about their well-being and allowing children just to be children again.
I think it's been a bigger effect on the mental health, where they've been away, where things have been totally different, where, you know, formative years of their life have been completely disrupted.
Miles can remember school before COVID, but for Ella in year 2, some things will be new.
If we get to play with everyone, it's more fun because we have more people in our games. There's more choice for who to play with, and we can hug more people.
Shaking hands and fist bumping, high fives, and all of your, the stuff that makes you feel comfortable.
Across the field at the secondary, team sports will be back this term. These year 7s more worried about fitting in than COVID.
It's a bit weirder than primary school, where I was just top of the whole school. Now I'm bottom of a bigger school, so it's just going to be a bit harder because more people and more older people and taller people, and also maybe getting lost.
As this year starts, schools are reflecting on what they've learnt from the pandemic and what to keep. So in this school, for example, the one-way system is staying, masks for assemblies and online parent evenings.
How many electrons in the outer shell?
Next year, GCSE science exams are waiting for this class. The school wants to know what Year 11 should cover.
They've only got 9 months
and so they need to know what they need to learn, and then we need to make sure that we're delivering that for them. So it's crucial at the moment.
And this is what can keep them learning in school. Testing is the first line of defence against coronavirus. Bronwyn Jeffries, BBC News, East Sussex.
The global climate talks to be hosted by the UK in Glasgow in November are now less than 2 months away. And today, the UK government minister in charge of the conference, Alok Sharma, has been meeting his counterparts in China. As the world's fastest growing economy and a major polluter as well, China will be an all-important voice at the negotiating table. So what are the main challenges facing those trying to forge a new agreement at the talks? Our science editor, David Shukman, has this assessment.
Year after year, the countries of the world have gathered for huge conferences on climate change. I've seen for myself how they can go wrong, like in Copenhagen in 2009. So what's on the cards now for Glasgow? Well, the first challenge is to get rapid cuts in the gases heating the planet, something that just hasn't happened so far. Back in the early 90s, when climate negotiations started, about 35 billion tonnes of greenhouse gases were being emitted into the atmosphere every year. And since then, despite all the talking, those emissions have just kept climbing. Now, with all the plans and promises to cut them, they could fall to about 46 billion tonnes a year by 2030, but the science is incredibly clear that they need to come down far more than that if we're to have any chance of heading off the worst effects of higher temperatures, which is why this is such a crucial issue for the talks in Glasgow. Next, there's the question of financial help for the poorest countries. This is long overdue. It's developing nations like the Philippines that are hit hardest by climate change. They have been promised $100 billion a year, which they say is vital to adapt to more dangerous conditions.
We want to see adaptation finance flowing to climate vulnerable nations that bear the brunt of extreme weather events or climate change, but had no reason to cause it.
A third challenge is finalising the rules for measuring carbon. Previous meetings haven't managed to. This matters because as countries cut their emissions, there needs to be a way of accounting for that. Likewise, if forests are kept untouched to store carbon, that also has to be recognised.
Right now, for example, if a major company wanted to, say, invest in preserving standing forest in the Amazon, there's not yet any clarity on whether those credits that would be generated from that can be claimed by Brazil as well as by the company making that investment.
So as Glasgow prepares for thousands of delegates, there's a lot at stake. COVID makes it all more difficult, and there are just 8 weeks to get ready. David Shukman, BBC News.
Britain plans to further extend the post-Brexit grace periods on some goods imports to Northern Ireland. The extension will suspend new checks on cross-channel trade for some items like cold meats, due to be implemented within weeks. The government says it is to give London and Brussels more time for talks about trade. Clarence House says the Prince of Wales has no knowledge of claims that the head of one of his charities helped to secure an honour for a wealthy donor. The Prince and one of his closest advisers, Michael Fawcett, have been reported to the police over the allegations. Mr Fawcett, who has temporarily stepped down as chief executive of the Prince's Foundation, is accused of promising to help secure a knighthood and British citizenship for a Saudi businessman. Cricket news, and India have won the fourth test against England at the Oval. England were chasing a record 368 runs on the final day, but were bowled out for 210. And India now have a 2-1 lead in the series with one test left to play. Our sports correspondent Joe Wilson was watching. And that's it. Now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.
Well, most of us had a fine day on Monday, lots of sunshine, and now a dose of summer heat is on the way over the next couple of days as temperatures are expected to hit 30 degrees in one or two spots. It's not going to be quite so hot for most of us, but I think in the Midlands, that's where we're going to really feel the heat. Anyway, in the short term, it's quiet on the weather front across England and Wales. A little bit more cloud and some dampness there in the northwest of the country. These are the morning temperatures, pretty balmy, 15 in Glasgow, 15 expected in London. A lot of us will be waking up to sunshine, some of us to some mist and fog, which will last through the morning in 1 or 2 spots. But essentially speaking, it's a quiet day with hot sunshine, particularly in the Midlands, up to around 30 degrees, 27 in Hull, mid-20s expected in southern and central Scotland. The day after that, on Wednesday, we're expecting some showers, maybe some thunderstorms out west.
The source of all life, flowing through history and shaping humanity, boils down to one simple molecule, H2O, the molecule that made us. Continues tomorrow at 9 on BBC4 and iPlayer.
This is BBC News. I'm Sean Lay with the headlines. The Taliban say they're now in full control of Afghanistan after seizing the Panjshir Valley, the last area of armed resistance. The claim is disputed by resistance leaders who are calling for a national uprising. Families of victims of the MH17 disaster have given testimony at the murder trial in the Netherlands of 4 suspects accused of shooting down the plane over Ukraine in 2014. All 298 people on board died. In what's described as a miracle rescue, a 3-year-old boy missing in rugged Australian bushland since Friday has been found alive. He was spotted sitting in a puddle using his hands to drink water. And one of the most famous landmarks in London is finally emerging from scaffolding after a 5-year restoration project. It means the chimes of Big Ben will once again be heard over the Houses of Parliament.